Sand Creek Massacre was perhaps one of the most unfortunate events in the history of U.S. indigenous peoples' relations. It occurred in southeastern Colorado, November 29th of 1864, in which a village of Cheyenne, primarily Cheyenne but also Arapaho peoples, was attacked by a force of Colorado militia under the command of Colonel John Chivington. A number of indigenous peoples were killed, and then perhaps the worst part of the massacre was that throughout the course of the day, the bodies were profaned in various ways and mutilated, and is not perhaps one of the brightest chapters in Colorado history. It was a very significant episode in national history as it marked a shift or a turning point in the history of relations between the United States and the indigenous peoples. My argument is that religion or religious ideals had a very strong influence both amongst the leadership as well as amongst the rank and file of the individual men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. One of the striking things about the Sand Creek Massacre is the level of religious involvement that so many of the leaders, especially within the Colorado Cavalry, had with the Methodist Church and with other churches within the territory as well. John Chivington, the colonel who's in charge of the Colorado forces, is presiding elder of the Rocky Mountain District and a practicing minister for many years. John Evans, who was the governor at the time, was raised a Quaker but converted to Methodism fairly early in life, was instrumental in founding one Methodist university just outside of Chicago, Northwestern University, in a town that is now named for him in Evanston, Illinois, and then also is a founder of Denver University up in Denver, which also has an affiliation with the Methodist Church. And Evans remains an active both philanthropist as well as director in Methodist affairs throughout his career, partially as a result of the Sand Creek Massacre, asked to resign from his duties as governor, but remains in the territory and is very active in affairs in Denver and investments and a variety of different business pursuits. And so for me, it's striking how so many individuals who are intimately associated with this event have such strong religious leanings that they are either cultivating or certainly not ashamed of, and perhaps more so than other episodes or other incidences within this period. It's easy to see and easy to make these connections in this particular event. Coffin and Halbert were two participants in the event, members of the Colorado Cavalry, who came to sort of different conclusions later in life about the event. Both are probably two of the principal authors in terms of published memoirs about their experiences and their remembrances about the event. Coffin was from Boulder County in the area up near Longmont, and later in life, Coffin's views on the massacre, while he was present at the massacre, he felt very strongly against the atrocities, and in his earliest remembrances, published 15 years after the event, mentioned how that had a powerful effect on him, and that he had attempted unsuccessfully to argue against some of the depredations and mutilations that had occurred. Later in life, Coffin, according to the research I've uncovered, it becomes an avowed freethinker and follows sort of on that path. Whereas Irving Halbert, who was a resident, lifelong resident of Colorado Springs, has an elementary school named for him over on the west side of town, is one of the staunchest defenders of the Sand Creek Massacre and sort of adheres to those views. And it's, I think, of significance that Halbert's father was a Methodist minister and aligned very closely with John Chivington, who was also not only a minister, but the presiding elder of the Methodist Church in the Colorado Territory. And so my argument is that the religious motivations or religious backgrounds of these two individuals not only shape their actions at the massacre, but the perceptions and the ways that we interpret the event in the years afterwards. The central question, which is how could seemingly ordinary, everyday people come to this level of behavior and action? And arguably this is certainly this is a question I think that has contemporary relevance. We hear not infrequently about relationships between religious indoctrination and the appropriate levels of that within the armed forces today, as well as obviously we still have had recent episodes of unfortunate acts by service members of various nationalities, including the United States, against civilians in countries where we are in conflict. And so understanding that, preventing that, I think it has both a historical perspective, but also hopefully some use as well. The beauty of the site, or the drive out to the site, that's sort of the first impression that you get. But when you actually get to the site itself, when you get to the overlook, It's very powerful emotionally to know that you're at the site now where so many people lost their lives in such a horrific fashion. You do get an overwhelming sense that in many ways there's something left of what happened, and that you are on holy ground. You're at a place where something of great significance happened, in a place where people lost their lives, and deserves commemoration and certainly deserves remembrance. I would like to stimulate some discussion on the topic. It's certainly one that we've generated some discussion on in the past 10 years or so up at the Air Force Academy. But I think what that discussion has lacked has been sort of a historical perspective, and how these events, or how this has potentially impacted events in the past, and how I'm certainly not arguing that all military personnel should be irreligious. I think that faith is certainly an important and a sustaining part for many people. But I think when that zeal begins to impact military duties, and this is where I derived my title, the idea that our first duty was to our God and the next to our country, that those religious ideals somehow triumph the oath of office that we take to the Constitution, I think then we start to get into some very sort of uncomfortable terrain, and I think it's useful to have a historical perspective to facilitate that discussion. And so I'm putting some ideas forward. I'm certainly not arguing or advocating for one model or another as the absolute and finite answer, but I would like to have people discuss this from an academic and a collegial environment, and generate some discussion, and hopefully find some common ground amongst those who have sort of differing perspectives or ideas on this. The public has an interest in these sorts of topics, and so when we host our historical association meetings all over the country, we tend to exclude sometimes those who are outside of academia, and to have a forum here where members of the local community, students, college faculty can come together to interact and discuss, to share and exchange ideas, to challenge their thoughts, to develop their thinking further. I think it has wide benefits across the community.